Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Russia question. I'm very excited about our discussion today, and the book that we'll be discussing, as you know, is Understanding World Christianity, Russia, co-authored by Dr. Scott Kenworthy and Dr. Alexander Agadjanian. Scott Kenworthy is an associate professor in the Department of Comparative Religion at Miami University. His research interests focus on the history of Eastern Orthodox Christianity in modern Russia. His first book, The Heart of Russia, examined the revival of monasticism in 19th and early 20th century Russia. Kenworthy is currently writing a biography of Tikhon, who became patriarch of the Russian Church at the time of the Bolshevik Revolution. He has also published several articles on the controversy of the name of God in early 20th century Russia and Monathos. That writing will actually appear next in our next event, which will be on the Oxford Handbook of Russian Religious Thought, where we'll be discussing that work with the editors Carol Emerson, Randall Poole, and George Pattison. Alexander Agadjanian is a professor in the Religious Studies Center at the Russian State Humanities University in Moscow. He is the author of Turns of Faith, Search for Meaning, Orthodox Christianity, and Post-Soviet Experience. He's the editor of Armenian Christianity Today, Identity, Politics, and Popular Practice, and co-author of today's book, obviously. So he's contributed numerous articles in top journals in both English and Russian. So what we'd like to do to begin our event is to allow the co-authors to say a few words about the work as a whole, and then we'll have a discussion. I will have a discussion with the co-authors. At any point, if a question comes to mind, please do put it in your in the Q&A, and I'll incorporate it in our discussion to the best of my ability where it's fitting. And then we'll turn more specifically to all of the audience's questions after we've had our discussion about midway through. Welcome, everyone, and welcome, Scott and Alexander. Please, Scott, if you wouldn't mind introducing us to your book.
Okay, thank you very much, Michael, and thanks to Fordham University for sponsoring this event. This is very exciting for us, of course. So I guess what I would say, first of all, this is a book series, and we were invited to contribute this book, and the book kind of conforms in terms of its structure and so on to the other books in the series. I myself, I would say I straddle three academic fields in my work and my teaching and research, which is Orthodox Christian Studies, Global Christianity, which is a kind of emerging field, and Russian Studies. And so in effect, this book was aimed really at all three audiences. And when I think Russian studies, I think people who study Russian history, political science, literature, anthropology, sort of the whole gamut. So it's a tall order, right? It was a very challenging. But when you stop to think about it, there has been no general introductory text, kind of comprehensive overview of Russian Orthodoxy that a reader from any of those fields could turn to get a good grasp of the history of Russian Christianity and specifically Russian Orthodoxy. And as a consequence, I find this all the time in kind of general overview books, you know, on global Christianity or something like this, that they'll, you know, the few requisite paragraphs they'll devote to Russia will always contain the same old outworn stereotypes that specialists have abandoned long ago. But if you're not a specialist, you end up falling back on those, you know, those old stereotypes, you know, Peter the Great's reforms and all these kinds of things. Anyway, so the structure, as I said, of the book was dictated by the series, but just to give you the audience an overview of what's in the book, the first chapter is really an introduction to what is Orthodoxy in general, because I was thinking of my students, I'd say in my introductory class to Russian studies, who know nothing about what Orthodoxy is. So before you're going to understand Russian Orthodoxy, you should understand what is Orthodoxy to begin with. So sort of laying the groundwork there and the basics in terms of faith and structure and tradition and all those kind of things. And then the second part of that chapter which Alex wrote, is more specifically on what is within the family of Orthodox churches, what is distinctive about the Russian tradition and its structure and lived religion and so on. The second chapter, which was Alex wrote, is a sort of the geographical spectrum and experience of Russian Orthodoxy. So how Orthodoxy kind of one of the things actually that's striking about the Russian tradition is how homogenous it is in many ways, despite the huge expanse of Russia. But nevertheless, you go west and there's the encounter with Jews and Western Christians and the Unity question. You go south and you have the encounter with Muslims, the Far East and the kind of missionary expansion and things like that. So that's, and also concepts like canonical territory and things like this. So that's the second chapter. The third chapter is a very broad overview of the history of the Russian Orthodox Church, you know, sort of from the foundations in Rus all the way through. But in particular, I tried to hone in on synthesizing the Soviet experience, because there's, again, very little that kind of pulls all that together, and the various back and forth of Soviet policy towards the church and the responses and the whole kind of questions of collaboration, persecution, etc. The fourth chapter, this was one that they asked us to write about biographies of kind of representative individuals. Turned out to be a really fun chapter to write. It's all focused on the past century, beginning with, I do a kind of conjoint 4 biographies of the 4 leaders of the Russian Orthodox Church in the early 20th century. So Patriarch Tikhon, Patriarch Sergei Strogorodsky, Metropolitan Yevlogy, and Antony Khrapovitsky. So both in Russia and abroad. And then I followed that up. I sort of followed the trajectory of both people in Russia and abroad. So Maria Skoptsova and people like this, but also one of the new martyrs in the Soviet Union. Matrona. Ending with the, you know, the 2 most recent patriarchs. The 5th chapter is an overview of Russian Orthodox theology, especially modern Orthodox theology. So really beginning in detail with the Slavophiles and Vladimir Solovyov, Florensky, Bulgakov, neo-patristic synthesis, this whole type of thing. And then the chapter ends with kind of the, you know, most of that story in the 20th century, of course, is abroad, but then looking also at what has happened in the late Soviet period, you know, Alexander Min and the post-Soviet sort of attempt to recover theology. And then the 6th chapter, why don't you say something about that, Alex? Because that's, you can summarize that better than I can.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, Michael, thank you very much for introducing us. So I'll continue, but before going back to this final chapter, just a few words about how it started. Interesting that I was in contact with Darren Daughtry, the person who is behind the whole series, the editor of the whole series, World Christianities, where our book is, and we were working with him on a volume that Michael mentioned in the beginning, introducing my works on Armenian Christianity, the one on Armenian Christianity. So Darren contributed a chapter to that book that I edited, and after that he invited me to join the series and invited me to start writing a book on Russian Christianity within the series. But then finally I started doing this, but then I realized that I can't do it by myself, because I'm more specialized, of course, in contemporary stuff and the things like history and some theological accounts and the elements of worship and kind of inside view for that. we really needed somebody who would join the project, and Scott was there. And Scott, we actually finally, since then, we started working together, exchanging all these parts and all these texts, and actually helping each other, I guess. Well, I'm very grateful to Scott for many things and many elements. I'm not even talking about the language, of course, which was a particular problem, of course, for me in a way, but also in terms of content. So it was really the co-working and cooperation of each of the chapters. And the last chapters that Scott just stopped with, that is on the post-Soviet developments and the contemporary stuff and the political implications and sociological, some kind of sociological perspective of what was going on with the Russian Christianity in the post-Soviet times. That was a kind of a challenging topic, of course, and we were trying to somehow coordinate our, assessments and our the structure and the composition of the how to present this very recent and current ongoing developments that to place it back to this frame of a millennial tradition. That was really a huge challenge, of course. Mm-hmm. As the whole book in this sense was a challenge to make such kind of introductory, comprehensive overview of so many challenging topics, like from theology to history and to contemporary political stuff, So that was a great experience. So.
Fantastic. Well, you do an amazing job. You and Scott together do an amazing job of negotiating all of those different topics. I, for one, appreciated how you were able to sort of jump from bird's eye views, as in your geography of Russia and Russian Orthodoxy chapter, where you sort of look at the nodules and meeting points of Orthodox churches and Orthodox practices, not just within Russia, but throughout the world, and discuss what holds them together. I thought that was lovely, the way that you brought in the holy springs and the places where, the monasteries where you'll have pilgrimages, and then the sort of central, more visible churches in the larger cities. And yet you are always very careful to tie it down to the personal level, that is the individual worshiper, and to point out how much variance there is within those broader traditions. So I guess jumping off of what you had just said about the link between the history of Russian Orthodoxy and the history of Russia, it becomes abundantly clear just how connected those two things are. Alex, was that something that you had focused on that you could say more about? Oops, you'll have to unmute again.
So yeah, I was muted.
There we go. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yes, that as I said, that was the main task of the whole thing, as for me at least, because I had this historical background, mostly written by Scott, but we were kind of cooperating on that as well. But my idea was to give this general picture. There was a challenge. There was a kind of a temptation to approach the contemporary stuff, the contemporary developments from per se, like an kind of isolated, absolutely specific period with specific developments. And actually, that was a challenge because that we could go too far into some kind of politicized, description of what's going on. And of course, there are lots of criticism right now about the position of the Russian Orthodox Church and the Moscow Patriarchate, and we see this, of course, and we were trying to include it into the last chapter because doing this kind of assessment of contemporary and current political events, because definitely there is within the Russian Church in Russia, there are many sincere believers who are very critical, and to the position of the Moscow Patriarchate and the kind of a collaboration and dependency upon the ruling regime, who are very critical of the fact that the church is kind of completely within this authoritarian trend and approves this trend in a way. So, but and this trend has been expressed in the book. Though again, we were trying not to politicize it, although we received some criticism on that we didn't went too far in this direction. But we were trying really to be to avoid reducing the life of the church to this kind of alliance with the state or the current state and things like that.
Yes.
We were. We are talking about about a millennial tradition which produced a rich culture that became flesh and blood of a complex cultural tradition. So the idea of the book is to present a larger impact and perspective, and to avoid such a kind of a reduction from today's particular disappointments that we might have. So that's how I was thinking that this retrospective to this millennial tradition, with all this, all its pluses and minuses, all this hard developments, was extremely important for me to place the current urgent, topical issues of today's Orthodox history.
Great, and it seems like one of the overarching questions that you attempt to address in the book, and successfully, I believe, is just how exactly the resurgence happened in Orthodoxy, and what kind of resurgence it is, right? Because we have this thing that we have the sense that it's kind of all of a sudden after the fall of communism, looking in from the outside, right? But you're very careful to point out, the ways in which it stayed alive under Soviet rule. Scott, I wonder if you could tell us more about that aspect. It seemed like something that you were concerned with. You wanted to show that, wait, it's not just that simple. It's not just that the ones who stayed compromised and we're all working for the KGB and we have nothing to learn from them. It's that they chose to take on take a different approach to the Soviet regime by staying there and keeping some semblance, to the best of their ability, alive of the Orthodox traditions that they knew. Could you tell us more about that, Scott?
Yeah, you put it yourself very well, of course, and the challenges were immense. And even with somebody like a controversial figure like Patriarch Sergei Stragorodsky, who of course is easy to criticize for maybe having compromised too much, but then I do a thought experiment of putting myself in his place, and it's like, I don't know what kind of decisions I would have made, and it's easy to judge from the outside, but the circumstances were just the challenges were unbelievable. But there were so many figures that one could look at. So in the before World War II, of course, it was kind of all out warfare, and the Soviets really were sort of taking the gloves off to crush the church as much as possible, especially in the 30s. But then in the post-war period, where they kind of policy towards the church changes so dramatically and becomes one less of hostile attempt to crush, but rather to control, you find individuals who had to negotiate that and navigate those challenges in ways where, they were sincerely trying to continue the faith and practice the faith and make the church available for ordinary believers, while not compromising on the essentials, but maybe having to compromise on the inessentials, something like that. So I think of, there was one, the abbot of the Trinity St. Sergius Lavra was Pimen Chmielewski, who later became Archbishop of Saratov, if I remember correctly. And I found some, internal Soviet documents about him in the 1950s, where they were frustrated because he was too active in recruiting new monks, and he was too active in allowing the monks to preach to pilgrims, and he was too active in terms of allowing the bookstore to sell religious books all times of day. And they tried to crack down on all of these things and pressure him to scale back. And his response was one of like, oh yeah, well, I can't do this because I have to consult the patriarch about it. And, oh yeah, well, no, that's not really what's going on. In other words, it was a cat and mouse game where he's trying to defend the church and defend the practice, but he can't openly defy it because he will be removed, right? So he has to compromise in some areas and obfuscate and things like this in other areas. And I think there's so much to understand about, especially the post-war Soviet period, that we've only begun to scratch the surface of. It's much, much more complicated than any of us.
Absolutely, and you mentioned Alexander Min also, who is another person who stayed behind, engaged in Orthodoxy, right? And comes a bit later, of course, but I think what comes to mind for me was the way in which the resurgence takes place. Some of it sort of went underground and stayed and then resurfaced. Some of it went abroad and then came back in a big way. Particularly through the Paris St. Sergius theology, and then also through St. Vladimir's and the Neo-Patristic tradition that you discussed there. But in general, it seems like, have you heard of the Streisand Effect? This is a peculiar thing where at one point, Barbara Streisand actually took issue with the state who had surveyed the coastal land in California. And what ended up happening was that her property appeared for the public to see. And she wanted to take it down because hundreds of people were seeing her private property. But of course, by wanting to take it down, then it became news, and then millions of people ended up seeing her property, right? And something similar has happened with the resurgence of Orthodoxy, I think, right? Where there was such a concerted attempt to repress it, and a violent attempt initially, and even up to the middle of the 20th century to repress it, that it didn't just go away, it just became less visible. And this resurgence is sort of that moment where, now that we've been told that we can't look at something for so long, we really, really want to look at it as a country. How do you think that lines up, Scott?
Yeah, in some ways that's definitely true. But of course, one of the paradoxes of, and maybe Alex can follow up on this, one of the paradoxes that we try to start the book off with is that when the sort of lid was taken off and people could freely practice and we could look at it again and all this kind of stuff, and of course there was the massive wave of people getting baptized and under the last few years of the Soviet Union and then the early 90s and so on, but that didn't actually translate into increased levels of religious participation. I think the numbers of people who go to church on a regular basis today is not probably any higher than it was in the Soviet period, paradoxically, right?
Even though that they would answer on the survey that they are Orthodox, right? If they're not attending, they're not the, what is the word? Отцерковленные, right? The in church. Отцерковленные. There we go. Отцерковленные. They're not in church, in other words, believers, but they're just sort of identifying with it at some kind of, well, survey level, maybe spiritual level on the other. Yes, Alex.
Yeah, in the late Soviet period, there was an effect of this forbidden fruit, or how do you call it? Well, trying to get, that's what you were saying about this example that you. So and of course the orthodoxy, well, all kind of religious traditions, and mostly orthodoxy, of course, in Russia, bear this kind of very intense, very thick, symbolic and even semiotic, meaning. So that attracted so many people during the 1970s, 1980s, and of course Alexander Mead, that you mentioned, was definitely in the very middle and the very center of this process. It was a kind of a semi-underground, and then semi-underground attempt to use the symbolic capital that was was produced by the very fact of these things being forbidden, and being cut, the cultural tradition, the part of the cultural tradition that was cut off. So that was so important in the late 1980s and early 1990s when the Resurgence took place. So it was a kind of a huge reopening, rediscovery of the huge tradition, along with all other stuff that have been forbidden and so on. So, but at the same time, sociologically, we need to understand that the 20th century was the period of secularization, even the kind of objective, even without, that was a repressive communist extremes of forced secularization, of course, but still there was this kind of objective processes in the societies, like the urbanization and cutting with old rural traditions and things like that, and that created a kind of a vacuum, well, not the vacuum, but that created some kind of atmosphere when you really want to find and to rediscover this tradition, but there is no enough material or sources that you can that's really the paradox. I guess the paradox that Scott mentioned, that there was no воцерковление in the right that you mentioned, is kind of the level of воцерковление in the classical traditional sense of the world was not as much, although the Orthodox as a public religion, as it was just everywhere. So that's a kind of a paradox of the resurgence and the revival that we are talking about.
Yeah. So also paradoxical is the nostalgia for it, right? I mean, because nostalgia, the most powerful drug of all, right? Here, it's a kind of odd nostalgia because it's nostalgia for something that may not have existed, right? In certain cases, that is, it's a reinvented history that is, that the country on the whole is trying to identify with, but they're also constructing it. In other words, it's not purely historical, but they're trying to find a kind of direct connection to it, and yet they feel nostalgic for this thing that belonged to the past. So it's an odd mixture of nostalgia and I guess creativity. I suppose nostalgia functions in that way often, but there are. Which
is why I think people draw on different aspects of the past, and therefore why you have different currents within the Orthodox Church today. I mean, among at the sort of grassroots level, one of the things we try to bring out in the book is that there's always been a diversity within the Orthodox Church, and there is today, and that's really important not to miss. I wanted to make one comment. I was thinking as Alex was talking that I had a Fulbright in Romania 15 years ago, and I've spent a lot of time in Romania. And the difference between Russia and Romania, where in Romania you had a shorter period of communism, it was never so brutal as it was in the 30s in the Soviet Union. And, especially by the late communist period, already beginning in the 70s, the state was willing to look the other way about, people getting baptized and married in church. It happened a lot more frequently than it did in the Soviet Union, where you would suffer consequences, in terms of your job and, things like this, if you were seen to be participating in church. And as a consequence, the sort of revival of Orthodoxy in post-communist Romania is much broader. The numbers of people who attend church is much higher, because in effect the continuity with the tradition was never as severely broken as it was in the Soviet Union. And so people, it's an identity in Russia today, right? You identify with the tradition, but you don't have any living memory of how it was practiced in many cases. Yeah.
Right. Yes. Well, one of the things that's interesting, one of the unexpected sort of forces at play in a resurgence in the middle of the century is something that you point to, which is the Pact of Non-Aggression between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. Would you tell us a little bit about how that ended up being one of the sort of leading to a kind of smaller resurgence that kept kind of living Orthodoxy alive in the Soviet Union?
Yeah, that was a crucial moment, because, as I said, in the 1930s, and especially in the terror in 1937-38, there was just this all-out attempt to completely suppress the church and anybody affiliated with it. I have if you'll permit me to quote this document.
Please.
From Yezhov, who was the head of the NKVD, the secret police, that he reports to Stalin in November 1937 about the effort to clamp down on the church in the midst of the terror. And he reports that from August to November of 1937, so 4 months, 31,359, quote, church people and sectarians had been arrested, including 166 bishops, over 9,000 priests, 2,000 monks, and almost 20,000 believers. Believers, right? Not just clergy, but believers. And he goes on to say that half of the clergy had simply been executed, right? And 1/3 of those believers that had been arrested had been executed, and the other 2/3 had been sent to the Gulag, right? I mean, this is unbelievable.
Massive, yes.
Basically, by 1939, there was 4 bishops left in the Russian church.
Incredible. Yeah.
The devastation was absolutely catastrophic. And then, so when the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was made, and the Soviet Union suddenly expanded to include Moldova and parts of Western Ukraine, and
Ukraine was critical in the.
Yeah, you had these territories where Orthodoxy had continued to survive and live and thrive, and all of a sudden you have all these churches and monasteries that are integrated right on the eve of the war. They probably would have closed all of those too, but then because the war broke out, they kind of stopped the suppression of religion. So I think a lot of Russian Orthodox priests, so I've heard, in the post-war period, actually come from Western Ukraine, ironically enough, because they were the only ones there.
Right. Yes, absolutely. And why is that? You mentioned that it's one of the lesser known atrocities in Western Christendom, right? That such devastating repression directed at believers, clergy, at their church, towards Russian Orthodox Christians, and it was astounding the level of murder and violence that existed. Beginning sort of with increasing intensity from revolution, not beginning in 1905 really, but increasing intensity up to what 38, 39 in the purges, and then this moment of non-aggression, things kind of shift, right? But you know, the atrocities of the pogroms are well known worldwide, and thankfully, and yet why do you suppose this this is not the case for this massive focused Russian Orthodox genocide?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And you know, I mean, I think it's not unusual for Western Christians to know about Bonhoeffer, right? Dietrich Bonhoeffer as the you know, sort of champion who suffered under Nazism. But those same Christians, you know, will never have had even a clue of what happened in the Soviet period. And most Russian scholars of the Soviet Union also, when you talk about the terror and stuff like this, you talk about the repression of cultural figures and, you know, party members and things like this, but the, you know, the repression against the church is sort of completely off the radar, although it was listed in the infamous order of August 1937 that initiated the terror, specifically listed church activists as one of the targets of the terror. This is completely under-researched, and I suppose that's why people don't know about it, because nobody's researched it yet. And of course, it's challenging because you have to have access to KGB archives, which are not
now not easy,
not accessible, and so on.
Yeah. Yes. Well, thank you both for doing the research to tell those stories and to identify those statistics, which are, you know, obviously so much more than statistics in this instance. I wanted to touch on sort of the way in which Orthodoxy is being, you know, reinvented now in Russia. And it seems like with all of its attempts at modernization, it's also, and you point this out in the book, still sort of adheres to a kind of conservatism. For instance, you say outright that a feminist theology in Orthodoxy does not exist, right? And you mentioned also at the same time, you know, there are these examples that you bring up of lived of saints' lives, of hagiographies of Matrona, the woman who was born without eyes, who, you know, who later on couldn't walk, but she had this prophetic or this clairvoyance and was rumored to even give Stalin at one critical moment in his life counsel, but that's unsubstantiated. Nonetheless, that, you know, she possesses clairvoyance. And then you mentioned Mother Maria, who was, I mean, a saint in the world, right, in Paris, you might say, and she did write some theological writings, but it's primarily, I think, her charitable work that she's remembered for, and maybe some of her writings. Then there are examples like Saint Xenia in the Orthodox tradition, who's you know, a patron saint of wanderers or travelers. There's Saint Juliana of Lazarevo, who's a patron saint of families. But where is the sort of theological tradition of women in Orthodoxy, and you know, why, with so many brilliant minds devoted to the scholarship, as we know, it's not sort of that women aren't producing the material. I think it has something to do with culture, I think. Would you agree with that there aren't women, there are not female, and to make just a crude, again, conservative gender distinction, there aren't female theologians there isn't a great female theologian tradition in Orthodoxy. Is that fair to say? They're revered for other qualities?
Yeah, that's a tough one, but I guess that I would say that I think there's I don't know, Alex could talk more about what's happening in contemporary Russia. There are some young you know, I think of Natalia Vasilyeva in Belarus, who is really doing amazing stuff. And interestingly enough, when I go to conferences, you know, there's a cohort of my very close colleagues who work on the Russian Orthodox Church, you know, Nadya Kitsenko that you had in the previous instance, and Vera Shevtsov,
Yes.
Perlinger, and all, you know, my teachers were male, right? Gregory Fries and so on. But my more immediate mentors are mostly female, which is really interesting. But that's, of course,
I had the same experience. Yes, yeah, abroad. Yes.
That's here in Russia. I think there are a growing number of female scholars. I think of somebody like Nadezhda Belyakova, who's writing about women in the church and things like this.
Yeah, that was I was going to mention as well, because that's I think it's a recent trend though. This kind of gender studies within Orthodox studies is not yet that much, you know, developed. But people like Nadezhda Belyakova and some others who produced a couple of volumes, I guess, quite recently, within last 10 years, at least, on the women in Orthodoxy and the gender approach to the Orthodox studies and things like that. So that's coming up. This starting kind of maybe under some kind of influence of the gender studies turn that was kind of belated in a little bit in the Russian studies, but started at least. So
yes, and so
I think it's and people like saints, that's kind of popular saints, like Matrona of Moscow or Ksenia of St. Petersburg, to take another example, are extremely popular. It's kind of part of this popular lived religion. Although we can explain partly their popularity by the fact that most of the devotees are also women. You know, like that was the case of the Soviet period, and actually it continues through the post-Soviet period right now in terms of on the level of this kind of popular pilgrimages and the participation and vocerkavlenia being in church and so and so. So that's a big interesting part of the future research, of course.
I think so. I hope that it is incorporated more. You know, it to be an essential component of the, you know, modernization or the addressing of the modern world with Orthodoxy. That doesn't mean, you know, turning neo-patristic theology into something else. It means using neo-patristic theology perhaps to turn our attention towards so many minds, so many brilliant minds who have so many things to contribute to the theological tradition. Right, and it seems like, well, for instance, with Kirill, Metropolitan Kirill, he has kind of, you reach a limit with him in terms of his engagement with modernity, right? I forget the name of the document, the social, what is it called?
Basis of the social concept, or some sort of clumsy
translation
like this.
The basis
right, which
of the social concept. Yeah.
Yes, there we go. And you know, it shows basically this is how much of modernity we're willing to engage and the degree to which we're willing to engage it. But it just seems like such a loss or a limiting factor in its modernization because of the vibrancy of you know, the Orthodox community, and in particular the way in which women have kept it alive, as you said, in the Soviet tradition and the scholars that exist. I don't know how, it seems like that would be an obvious way for the church to flourish without sacrificing any of its canonicity, really. But that does bring me to a point that I want to discuss with you, because one of the difficult things, I mentioned this in my lecture on icons, my introductory lecture on icons that I give, how to determine that something is good or canonical, right? The one way of looking at the word dogma is that which seems good, right? And how to determine which is good, what is good in the church is usually deferred back to the ecumenical councils, right? So the idea with the neo-patristics is that basically they determined what was good for us, and they kind of perfected it in a way. and we should stick to that. But how are these kind of shifts going to take place in terms of church dogma? What kind of new process is there to enact these changes so that you can, incorporate, I would say, for instance, one idea, female priests, and I know that's a whole topic, but how does a canonical change, how is something decided to be good presently in the Russian Orthodox Church, dogmatic in that sense? What process is in place for it?
Yeah, that's a tough question. I think Alex and I both might be inclined to, that's not our territory.
Yeah.
But what I was thinking as you were talking, and I also want to encourage our listeners to submit questions, by the way. But as you were talking, that there is this polarization in the Orthodox world right now, where it seems like the Moscow Patriarchate wants to take this position as being the defender of traditional values, whatever that means, and all this kind of stuff, and it's cast in a very anti-Western way often, and certain hot button issues, whereas the Patriarchate of Constantinople, if we want to use the terms that are driving our contemporary politics, is more progressive, concerned with the environment and social issues and things like this. And this polarization is deep. It's happening at that kind of official level, but I see it also happening within American Orthodoxy and things like this. But because the Moscow Patriarchate has kind of assumed that position, it does seem to be stifling, some of the developments within Russia itself. You have brilliant young theologians like Andrei Shishkov, who, basically lose their positions because they're too free thinking, as it were, at least that's my sense of it.
Right. And well, I don't expect us to solve an issue on the spot, but it's an interesting thing to think about. I want to turn to our audience for particularly Nina's question, something that you do engage in the book. What is the present relationship between the Russian Orthodox Church and Russian government? What influence does the church have over the state? And for example, the laws that rule society. That's something you do cover. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I can say a few words on that. As I said already, there is this kind of collaboration or cooperation between the state, correlation, I would say, even the correlation between the development of the government that was going on within the church in terms of institutional structure. It's kind of authoritarian trend that started with the Patriarchate of Kirill in 2009, which more or less correlated with the trend of authoritarian rule of Vladimir Putin since more or less the same time, right? And so they go like, there is certainly the correlation of this. And in this case, usually, there is one point that is often referred to is the so-called principle of symphony or symphonia, right? So, and this word and this term is evoked many times from both sides, from some political establishment who want to be, but mostly by the church, of course, by the church hierarchy that presents a kind of legitimize its position within this mainstream of the political developments, and at the same time legitimize the closeness and the cooperation and the collaboration with the state. So, I just wanted to say a couple of words about the symphony idea that we mentioned actually in.
Thank you. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, in the book, it's terribly important, of course, but it's sometimes it's being referred in scholarship so many times right now, reference to the symphony, and sometimes quite inadequately, kind of to characterize the allegedly special relationship of church and state in Orthodoxy. as a kind of millennial tradition, and that tradition allegedly never changed. We need to remember that symphonia or symphony is a kind of a political myth that claims to go back to this Byzantine period, and that worked as a kind of a sort of myth rather than the real political pattern or real political model, I would say. It never worked as a kind of a working political model. I mean, the very fact it is a myth is quite important in itself, because in the discourse of both political elites and the church, it was being used and as a kind of used as a kind of an instrument, how to say, of mutual approval, of mutual legitimacy between ecclesiastical and political authorities, right? But in reality, I would say the situation in Russia can be analyzed in common kind of models of church-state relations. Like there's the state church, one model, confessional priority model, collaborative model, separation principle. All this is the combination of all of this. You can find in Orthodox world like in Greece or in Romania or in Russia, although in kind of various combinations. So there is a kind of de facto combination of these various principles, why the symphony remained an ideological and kind of mythologized term, to my opinion, in my opinion. And so going back to the current situation, to the current relationship between the state, we are very far from any kind of symphony model, of course. But there is definitely this kind of mutual legitimation and the reference by the ruling regime to the church as a source of continuous national and spiritual, tradition that can be considered as a kind of a background and provides this kind of conservative ethos, which is definitely which the political regime is currently definitely in need, because there is no other ideological or kind of national identity kind of construction. So the church works, and the Orthodox tradition, I would say, works as a part of this ideological, general, overreaching ideological construction, and plays its own role within it without being totally, symphonically united or whatever.
Great, yes. Great question and answer. I want to
add in one, please. Just, whenever this question comes up as the historian, I always think of Peter the Great. And in like every book you read, you'll read about how Peter the Great subordinated the church to the state, made it a department of state, and put a layman at its head. And this is symbolized by the fact that, therefore, henceforth clergy had to record births, marriages, and deaths for the state and all this sort of stuff, as if this was somehow exceptional and made Russia distinctive in this way, right? I mean, every book repeats the same sort of stuff. Half of it is inaccurate, by the way, about it becoming a department of state, and a layman was never the head of the church. But aside from that, Peter was actually, his whole purpose was to make Russia more like Europe, especially Protestant Europe. That's exactly what was happening in Protestant Europe at the time. So this wasn't something that made Russia different and exceptional, but actually made it more European and more modern in a way.
We tend to assume the worst about Russia, I think, right? Hence the Russia question, actually. Yes. So I want to turn to, forgive me for not knowing exactly how to pronounce her name, Elisa Durham. Her question is, how did the thaw affect popular perception of religion as well as practice? Excellent, pertinent question that you address. You guys are going to love this book.
I'll start off, and then I can turn that over to Alex.
Yeah.
But what's interesting is that, you know, people who study Russian history or Russian culture always think of the thaw as like this. Finally, you have this kind of cultural relaxation and so on, and the de-Stalinization. But paradoxically, in the religious sphere, it was the opposite. So the late Stalin period was actually quite tolerant of religion. And Khrushchev, while, you know, allowing the publication of Solzhenitsyn and things like this, in terms of religion, he reinvigorated the anti-religious campaigns that were never as brutal as they were under Stalin, but the number of churches and monasteries closed and kind of repression of religious belief was actually quite strong under Khrushchev's period. But maybe, I don't know if Alex, you want to address the kind of long-term, how this then translated later on into the kind of revival that takes place.
Actually, yes. The first thing is that what Scott mentioned, this coincidence of the thought, political thought, with the intensification of the anti-religious campaign, which is kind of paradoxical in a way. But at the same time, you know, there was another interesting process that started with the thaw, with the Khrushchev thaw, and continued through the later Soviet period. Is a kind of a recoding of religion, of the religious tradition into the sort of cultural heritage, kind of heritageization, if we can use this word, of the religious traditions, when the churches were transformed. Some of the churches were transformed into well, some of them were closed by the campaign, but at the same time there were some bigger and important places that were recoded in terms of the pieces of art and architecture, you know, and that it was a huge process that was in line with the kind of rediscovery of the hidden Russian, old Russian ethnic, popular, whatever tradition that was a kind of a hidden under the Soviet constructions of the Soviet ideological constructions, you know. So that was an interesting result, a long-term result of the thaw, that some of the religious elements of religious culture were actually allowed to be and to continue and to be developed and to be appreciated in terms of the cultural heritage. And through that, many people, many, you know, the whole generation of the 60s, as Шестидесятники, and later on in the 70s, came to be much attracted by this tradition that was somehow, you know, was reformatted, as I say, in the Soviet cultural terms, but at the same time, through that, it became available. It became available, and at the same time, it's a kind of the same process that these kind of derivenshiki writers, the writers of the who celebrated the the lost rural traditions, you know, with all these elements, including the religious ones, you know, and that was paradoxically coinciding with this anti-religious campaign. So the long-term effect, of course, was the creation of some kind of nostalgia by among the urban intelligentsia, both towards the rural past and the religious past, through these complex processes. Yeah.
Yes, Scott, did you want to add anything to that, or is it?
No, I think that's good.
It covers it. Yeah, sound answer. we're coming up on time here, but I want to incorporate Dr. Anne Lounsbury's question, if we can. Maybe we can finish on that. She asked, besides the idea that quote, Peter subordinated the church to the state, what are some of the other maybe unfounded stereotypes and cliches that you often hear repeated in accounts of Orthodoxy in Russia? And which would you most like to counter?
Yeah, that's
excellent
a great question.
note to end on.
Yeah. I mean, of course, the whole idea that somehow the Orthodox Church exists to prop up the state or act as its, ideological bolster and things like this, whether historically or today, not that it's not true, right? But to focus only on that when there's so much else going on is one problematic issue. I guess another one, which has again been pretty much turned over by specialists, but still gets out there among the non-specialists, is like the popular religiosity and this whole idea of dvoyeveria, as if Russian peasants were all superstitious and really just pagan with a veneer of Christianity and so on. For the being in the kind of world Christianity sphere, we speak of enculturation, right? That Christianity takes roots in particular cultures and particular traditions. And the fact that there may have been some pagan practices that were Christianized, this happened everywhere and happens everywhere Christianity has ever spread. And the idea that these were pagan or something like this or superstitious and needed to be rooted out is a peculiar consequence of the Protestant Reformation. But it's, if you think of Catholicism in Latin America and the Virgin of Guadalupe and things like this, right? This sort of ways in which Orthodoxy or Christianity in general anywhere takes root. And to dismiss that is like somehow just pagan leftovers, especially when what the peasants themselves thought they were doing was Christian, whatever its origins may have been. They understood those things as having, as being Christian practices. So that's another one.
Fantastic, Alexander.
Yeah, I just one thing to mention. I'm not going to continue with this list of stereotypes. There are many, but what I was thinking while listening to Scott right now, well, there is another thing that is not now much in vogue, and something that I find quite productive is the so-called contextual theology. The contextual theology, right? So the concept itself. We can speak of conceptual theology, but also the contextual Christianity, contextual Christian practices, and all this kind of stuff. So when there is something that seeks universality, and we can speak of Christianity in general as a kind of a universalistic, ecumenical, universalistic project in general. But this one is this phenomenon naturally splits into many cultural, racial, gender, social forms. That's what contextual theology, or theology in context, is now developing. The question comes up, of course, whether this contextual multiplicity, variety, gives the universal message or not. But that applies very much to when we are talking about the Russian Christianity, because, well, our book is on the Russian Christianity, but at the same time we had always to compare and to correlate it with the ecumenical universal Christian ethos or theology or practices and things like that. So, but we see that there is this kind of contextualization of this universal phenomena in Russia, and our main idea was actually to find this place to to perceive these elements of contextualization of what is really Russian in this larger, for this larger phenomenon. So, thank you.
Fantastic. Yes, I think that it's an amazing sort of amazingly concise analysis of what common points exist in Eastern Orthodoxy and what distinguishing features exist even within the Russian tradition that you're going to strike. I, for one, am certainly adding, have for all intents and purposes, added this to my required readings for my Russian icon in dialogue with the arts course. I strongly recommend this book. It's clarifying not only for its articulation of the most influential moments in recent Russian history and Russian Orthodox history, but also as a sort of to have an understanding of what constitutes right worship or orthodoxy more broadly speaking. So I'm indebted to you for this fantastic book that you've written. I intend to have it spark many more conversations with my students in the future. And I hope this is the first of many more for us to come. And thank you so much. The book again is Understanding World Christianity, Russia, co-authored by Scott Kenworthy and Alexander Agadjanian. There is a link to it on their page where you register if you are when you are ready to buy it. One more quick announcement before we part ways. I will be having the next event on November 15th with Carol Emerson, Randall Poole, and George Pattison, the editors of a phenomenal work of tremendous scope called the Oxford Handbook to Russian Religious Thought. And I hope that our co-authors will be able to join us for that. And I'll put this in the chat for those of you who want to put it in your calendars and register for it.
Thank you very much.
So Alexander and Scott, thank you so very much for visiting us and for such an interesting conversation. I hope that more people know about your book very soon. It'll be good for them.
Thank you so much for hosting, and thanks for everybody for tuning in and listening.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael. And thank you, everybody.
Thank you.